My name is Iona Wayland, and I'm going to bring you a star-free, spoiler-free review of the novel Dig by A.S. King. I did a brief update as I was reading this book because it was so incredible for me and it was such an intense experience that I had to find a way to express my thoughts because they were coming out before the end of the book. This is what the cover looks like. I had never heard of A.S. King before. Actually, the reason I started looking for this book is because the booktuber Chandler Ainsley was doing a taste test for people who she admires or follows on in the booktube world, and she was doing something that she kind of like did a comparison of taste. She read the favorite books of other booktubers, and I forget what booktuber actually read this to begin with, but when I saw Chandler having such an extreme reaction to it, I thought I would read it just to give it a try. I really like to go over trigger warnings beforehand. There are trigger warnings of suicide, homophobic and racist speech, self-harm, molestation, rape, and domestic violence. So I like to go over first things that I didn't much care for and then things that I did like so that I can end on a positive note. Most of my issues were in the very beginning of the book. At first I found that it was really difficult to understand the setting, what was going on, who was talking. It starts at a pretty breakneck pace, which I usually really like in books, but I think it was such a quick read and such fast pacing. In the very beginning, I didn't have a way to ease into it, so it kind of slapped me in the face. There's an abrupt sentence structure that's clipped and brusque, and I usually do like books like this, and I'll get into on the liking side what I did like about it, but I think when it hits you in the very beginning and I haven't been acclimated to the novel yet, it was difficult to go from first person, third person. There were many different points of views. And though this connects later, in the very beginning, it was difficult for me to really lose myself in the story. Even though most of the timeline is set across 83 or 85 days before this Easter gathering, there were different references to other timelines that did get a bit confusing until the wrap up at the end. I'm also one, maybe I'm just a no-nonsense reader. I like a tight cast of characters. I really feel like I get connected to them. The cool part is that I did feel connected to each and every one of them, which I was very surprised about. But in the beginning, I was worried that I would not feel a connection to all of the characters. I felt like I was in over my head. Something else I didn't much care for either is that each point of view, even if it changes from first person to third person, the narration style was the same, in my opinion. So those clipped, brusque sentences that I do love because it picks up the pace of the story, I was a little upset that everyone's voice had a similar tinge to it. Also, this isn't really a huge deal, but as a mental health professional, there was one part in, I want to say like 40% of the book, like in the 40% mark of the book, there are these mentions of tunnels. And basically, I think what it's depicting is depression or anxiety or negative thought loops that people get wrapped up in, and they feel like they're getting enclosed in a tunnel. And I thought that was well done. However, these two characters are tripping on acid, and one character says to the other, "Oh, I can see your tunnel. I totally understand what you're talking about. It echoes in here." And that was something that the one of the main narrators was like, "Oh my gosh, he does see it. Like, it does echo. That's something I've never told anyone." I get that there were drugs involved, so like you're going to have experiences of things that you wouldn't normally have, and you're going to be exposed and say things that even if that event isn't happening, it can feel like it is. The problem I had with that is that later on, It was referenced several times by that one character, like, he was there, he was in that tunnel, he understands me. And this is a type of tactic called head hopping that abusers use to convey to sometimes they convey to victims that they can get in their head, they can read their minds, they can read their thoughts. And even though that's not what was going on, that wasn't the message at all, I don't like that head hopping abuse, well, potential abuse, could be seen as a love interest. And the book is incredible, and it delves into mental health and like all kinds of these other things. So that was like a super minuscule thing. I just wanted to point out that head hopping isn't real, and it's not a possibility. And I just don't like that it was used as a little bit of a romantic device. Now for things that I totally loved. It was a fast read, and even though it was difficult for me to sink into the book in the beginning, there was definitely, once I understood it, like once I got it, I was totally there. It was incredibly engaging. It's also the first novel that I can think of off the top of my head, so potentially that I've been exposed to, that uses the formatting of the book to accentuate a mental health spiral. I mentioned tunnels before, and that was something that they brought up. Was A.S. King formatted it so that the thought processes that were closing the person in got smaller and smaller and smaller. The font stayed the same, but the narrowing of the actual margins was incredibly impactful. Also, I have never read a book that delved into generational trauma of privilege at the same time that like nuances it so incredibly. There were these undertones of secondary communication. Let me nerd out for a second. Secondary communication comes from when you say one thing, but there's a hidden message underneath. Whoever is using that hidden message strategy has power over the other person. If I were to come home and be like, there are dishes in the sink to my husband, that would mean that I have slight power over my husband, and there are dishes in the sink is just a statement, but there's a secondary communication there saying you better do the dishes, which this doesn't happen, but just as an example. Throughout this book, I felt myself clenching and becoming anxious, feeling uncomfortable, and that was the point. But I finally realized it's because there was impeccable use of secondary communication between different generations. The silent power struggle between characters and the different generations of characters. I also thought it was incredibly done how generational trauma was nuanced from generation to generation, and how the more aware different generations were of it, the more shame or guilt or relief there was, because they were able to figure out what was going on. Also, a lot of what I work with as a mental health professional deals with dissociation. And this book just incredibly took many different kinds of experiences of dissociation and summed it up gorgeously with each character. It was such an immersion into the different types of dissociation. There was derealization, there was depersonalization, there were fugue states. Even though there's one character that you'll figure out what her deal is later, she called it flickering. Even though there was more of a concrete representation of flickering, like her version of this thing she calls flickering, it still could be used as an allusion to what it's like to feel like you're going into your own world. There's definitely a character there that has OSDD, so it stands for otherwise specified dissociative disorder, which means that you may have moments where you hear other parts of yourself, you hear other alters and stuff, and that was just incredibly represented without being like, this is OSDD. It just naturally showed this one character, and it delved into why it was important and how it helped her survive. I just was like so incredibly impressed. Also, I can't say this enough, The delve into race, privilege, classism, these heavy, heavy topics that I was like nervous that for the author A.S. King, I was nervous for her to dive into it, and I she she did it. She nailed it. As I read, there were different and evoked emotions to the point where I had to sometimes take like little breaks and come back to reality, because the emotions of panic, anger, fear, and sadness were so overwhelming at times because I was so sucked into these characters' lives that I sometimes had to take a second to ground myself while I read. However, it was that incredible curiosity in me that wanted to know what was happening that ended up continuing being the fuel for my reading, because I just had to know what was going to happen. Also, I don't know if you're a mood reader or not. I'm a mood reader, which just means that you like to read books that match the overall theme or feeling of whatever month or season it is. This was perfect timing because the book starts at either late January, early February, and then ends in April for the most part. Of course, there are other timelines referenced and sometimes other timelines discussed. Overall, it's like right now in the midst of it, basically winter into spring and what that means. Also, as I've mentioned before, I think I'm a no nonsense reader. I like every character, every scene, every moment to drive the plot forward. I'm not saying it has to be this like mind-blowing epiphany or anything, but just something that definitely draws the reader in and moves the plot along. Like, I don't like fluff so much. And I was so impressed that every single detail that the author included in this narrative was absolutely necessary. There were descriptions. I can't get into it because then I'm a no spoiler reviewer, but I'll get into spoiling if I get it too far into it. There were times where I felt like trying to piece together this mystery as well, and I felt this sense of accomplishment when certain details that I had logged away actually turned out to be important and was helpful to identify characters. Oh, I don't know if I mentioned this in my did not much care for side. The characters' names, like most of the characters' names, weren't revealed until the very, very end of the book. And it was very frustrating for me, and I couldn't figure out who was talking, especially because the narration styles matched. It turned out that if I would have just taken a second and read the titles of each chapter, I would have known what was going on. But overall, I see why now the names weren't used till later, and it helped me pay attention as a reader to all the details to figure out who was talking, who was interacting with who, what timelines overlapped with each other, what narrative intersected. I was working, like it wasn't a passive read. I know I read it on my Kindle, but I looked it up and it turns out it's like 398 or 400 pages, and I read it a little over 24 hours. And coming from someone who's been in a slump for a couple years, I feel like I'm back. I like devoured that thing, and it was intense. If you like books that delve into racism, classism, sexism, all the isms, which I love looking at that stuff and figuring out why it's happening and where all the nuances are, then you'll love this book. Also, if you like mystery, dark and twisty, you'll also like this book. If you don't like present tense, first person present tense on occasion, or switching narratives, you don't like that brusque clipped style that's very popular right now, then I don't think you'll like this book, or it'll take you a while to get into it. But overall, even when I was a little wigged out at first, it was an incredible experience. Like, I would absolutely recommend to everyone to read it. It was so powerful. What a powerful book. That's my review of Dig by A.S. King. Let me know if you've read this book in the comments below, if you're looking forward to reading it, and any other suggestions. You can find me on Instagram. Thank you so much. I'll see you next week.